Greetings from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. It's a rather beautiful spring day here in Cooperstown. We're very glad you could join us for today's virtual Voices of the Game program. My name is Bruce Marcus, and I work in the education department. Today, I'll have the privilege of talking to someone who's been very helpful to the Hall of Fame for many years, Leslie Heaphy. Leslie, historian, author, and professor, an authority on women in baseball and Negro Leagues baseball, among other topics. Leslie also a professor at Kent State University. Leslie's the founding member of the journal Black Ball. She is an author of numerous books and also the winner of the Society for American Baseball Research's very prestigious Bob Davids Award. It's really regarded as the highest honor given out by the organization. We welcome to Virtual Voices of the Game, Leslie Heaphy. Leslie, it's great to be with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much, Bruce. I really appreciate the opportunity to sit and chat with you today.
Well, we're always find it a pleasure to talk to you. We have met a couple of times over the winter. You came out and addressed the education department about the subject of women in baseball and Black baseball as well. And of course, you continue to make trips out here as part of one of the special curators, the Fabulous Five curators, as they call, that are helping us out with our Black Baseball Initiative. As you can see, Leslie has authored a number of books, two of them shown on the screen here, the Encyclopedia of Women in Baseball, also a history of the Negro Leagues. I want to begin, though, Leslie, a bit of a personal angle. Tell us about working at Kent State. You've been there as a professor for a number of years. Tell us a little bit about your day-to-day job.
Sure. So I've been at Kent State at the Stark campus. Kent State has a very wide regional system, and so I actually teach in North Canton, where the Football Hall of Fame is actually located, which makes it interesting. And so I've been here just under 30 years. Hard to believe, but and I have to say, being a professor most of the time is one of the coolest jobs you can do, because every day, I like the fact that every day is different. Every class is different. I teach a variety, of subjects, but 15 weeks or 5 weeks in the summer, and then it changes. And you get to do another topic. I get to teach all kinds of classes, including a Negro Leagues class, my sports history class, variety of baseball classes. And, I always tell students that I have one of the coolest jobs because I can go to a baseball game, football game, basketball game, and I'm still working, because I can usually take it back to class. So the interaction with students is what makes it fun. They're always so interesting, intriguing. They come up with really cool ideas, and to get to work with them every single day is the best part of what we do.
I actually didn't know that you taught a Negro Leagues course. Is that offered each semester?
I've been offering it for about the last 8 years as a summer course, actually, and it's a fully online course. So it's available then to others outside of the Kent State system as well.
Wonderful. Excellent. When I think of Kent State, and I've mentioned this to you before, the first name that always pops into my head is very famous alumnus Thurman Munson. Went on to a great, although tragedy-shortened career with the New York Yankees. Are there tributes to Thurman Munson on the campus?
So there's two things on the campus. He is part of the Kent State Athletic Hall of Fame. And so his picture and everything resides in the hallways of the Mack Center, where they play their basketball games and things. And that's the main tribute that you see. They also have some photographs and materials related to his life in their archival collection as well. The biggest local tribute to Thurman Munson is right here in Canton. There's a baseball field named after him because this is where he played before he went on to and so the Thurman Munson Stadium is just been actually last year renovated again and looks really wonderful. They've got a beautiful plaque down there with highlights of his career and things on it. And so that's really where you see one of the biggest tributes to him.
Interesting. When you think about Kent State, you think about Munson. And I used to think, well, he was the only major league player that went to Kent State. And then I did some research. I found out that isn't close to being true. There's a long list. Some of the names include Rich Rollins, Gene Michael, Dirk Hayhurst, pitcher turned author, catcher Art Kushner, Steve Stone, Andrew Chafin, Travis Shaw. So quite a few major league players have played at Kent State. Maybe we don't think of it as a baseball factory. It's not a baseball factory, but it does have an interesting connection to our pastime.
Absolutely. And it is something, I think most people don't think of baseball as something that you assess, partly because we're here in the Midwest, so the weather doesn't lend itself to year-round baseball playing, things like that. So, but certainly has its fair share of ball players who've gone on. And it's funny because Dick Hayhurst, a couple years, right, I keep saying a couple years, and then I think about the pandemic and realize it was more than a couple years ago.
Yeah.
A few years ago, he came to one of my sport history classes and talked to the students, which was really cool to hear about both his baseball career and his writing. And so that was a neat opportunity.
I understand Gene Michael was kind of a mentor to Thurman Munson. Gene passed away a couple of years ago. Did you ever have a chance to meet the Stick?
I did not, unfortunately. I've only read about his and his connection to Thurman, but I unfortunately never got a chance to meet him.
He was a very intelligent player, master of the hidden ball trick, which he accomplished 4 or 5 times during his career before people finally caught on. And then, of course, became a phenomenal general manager with the New York Yankees, really built those world championship teams of the late 90s and early 2000s. I want to spend a lot of our time talking about women in baseball. It is Women's History Month as we continue in March. And in some ways, this is a great starting point, the Vassar College Resolutes. They existed from 1866 to 1878. Often heard it said that they were truly the first organized women's baseball team. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. And the key emphasis is on organized, because people sometimes want to say these are the first women to ever play baseball, which of course is not an accurate statement. Women have played the game since its start, just like anybody else. But in terms of organized games, in 1866, these are the first records that we have of, and they typically played, at least in the start, internally. So it would be like freshmen playing the seniors and the sophomores playing the juniors, kind of an approach, until other teams start to develop at some of the other colleges, which gave them the opportunity to play interstate games, by the early 1870s.
Do we have any sense at all at how good they were, how good the instruction was they were getting?
We don't have a lot of detail on how good they were. Most articles, and this is typical of women's baseball, sadly, in the 19th century, and I would argue even into the 20th century, talk mostly about their uniforms, how they look, as opposed to how well they played. And so we don't get a lot of box scores. We don't get a lot of scores of any kind. What we do find when they are listed is they'll typically give the score and the number of hits. And so scores tended to be fairly lopsided and fairly high with lots of errors. But part of it is because they're just learning a brand new game, not getting a lot of instruction. And most of the instruction tended to come from other female teachers who had never played the game themselves.
Yeah. Of course, they're playing without gloves or mitts, which had not come into vogue for men
Correct.
either. And it is true that they played in these long wool dresses that we see in the photo?
Yes, they did. And what's interesting, of course, is early on, they were playing by that, still in the early days, by the rule where you could catch the ball on the bounce. And so the long skirt actually occasionally gave them an advantage of smothering the ball so it can't get away from them.
Yeah.
The problem with the long skirts was more when they ran the bases. And so you unfortunately read lots of articles about women's teams. And that's often they'll talk about them tripping over their skirts and falling as they're running the bases and things like that, which I can imagine would have been very true.
Yeah. You know, when I see this picture of the Vassar College team, this is dated 1876, this photo, the image of Mrs. Olson and Carolyn Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie trying to run around in long dresses in Walnut Grove, trying to play the game. I mean, the running must have been incredibly difficult.
Yep. Well, and not only do you have the long skirts, but what you can't see underneath them, of course, is they're wearing typically the laced up high boots as well. which would add even further to the lack of flexibility, et cetera, in terms of trying to actually run the bases. And so this is why you get the impression a lot of times that, and sometimes, and the newspaper articles certainly reinforced this, that a lot of this was more vaudevillian in approach. And to a certain degree, yes, some of that is certainly true, but some of that is due purely to the lack of proper equipment that they had that made it much more difficult for them to try to play.
They were the first organized team. There were some other colleges that eventually would have varsity teams as well. But this team, the Resolutes, essentially disbanded 1878. My understanding was that was not the players' decision to do that.
That's correct. There were two things that governed a lot of, and particularly it seems at Vassar, two of the things that you read in a couple of their newsletters and things was that there were two things that could shut down the team essentially. And one of them was they had to play a lot of their, at least early on, they were supposed to play where they couldn't be seen. So it meant they played behind the buildings so that the general public was not aware that they were doing this. But the other bigger issue, and I think this is ultimately one of the reasons they shut down, was they weren't supposed to break anything. And what by that, they didn't mean break a leg or an arm. It meant break a window, break the windows. And they did do that on more than one occasion, it appears. And that didn't seem to help the idea that they should be playing. And so eventually the administration, not the students themselves, said that this was not something they were going to support.
And that, of course, was not their fault. They were not given a proper field with distance from buildings.
Right. Exactly.
Another early team, and one that we here at the Hall of Fame are really only starting to learn about now in the education department. You gave us a talk to our staff, our teachers, a few months back, and you talked quite a bit about this team, the Dolly Vardens, not particularly well known, but they're from the 1880s, and they're also pioneers. This was a team of Black women that I believe played in Philadelphia.
Yeah, so the Dolly Vardens are what we consider to be the equivalent of a professional team, because they got paid for playing, and so that makes them also pretty unique and early in that. But they played in 1883 and 1884 in and around the Philadelphia area, and there appear to have been two Dolly Varden teams and then a third team that they played against as well, called the Captain Jinks, Jinks. And the three teams seem to have played back and forth together. Unfortunately, what we don't have is, as you pointed out, a lot of articles about them. Most of them, there's one article that appears regularly throughout 1883 in different newspapers across the country, and you think, oh wow, here's another new article. It's actually the same article written over and over again from the Philadelphia Press, and it appears all the way across the country into Montana's newspaper. So they were certainly getting some coverage, but the title of the article was Novel Women at Bat, and it is very much a wow, is this really serious? This can't be serious. This must be a joke. At least the first half of the article. Second half tries to talk about a little bit of their play, but most of the articles tend to focus again on what they were wearing, more so than anything else. And we get some really cool descriptions, very vivid descriptions, which has allowed recently there to be a children's book written about the Dolly Vardens. And the best part of that children's book is the illustrations, because they bring to life, I mean, really vivid color, the uniforms and things that they wore, the reds and the blues, the calico kind of color. We do get a few names in couple of the articles, and so we know that there was that the captain of at least one of the Dolly Varden teams was a young lady named Ella Harris. Don't know a whole lot more about her than that, but at least we have her full name. A lot of times newspaper articles would just refer to them as Miss Ella instead of and with no last name, and you're like, oh great, that doesn't help when you're trying to do research. And the Dolly Vardens, of course, set the stage for lots of other Black women's teams, including the one that you're looking at here, YWCA teams that seem to flourish in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century as a result of the play of the Dolly Vardens.
So this is not the original Dolly Varden's in this photo?
That is correct. That it is not. It is not.
Okay.
It's
that's-
a YWCA team. And it's interesting that this photograph generally gets put in as, but as far as I know, we do not have and yet have yet to find an actual photograph of the Dolly Vardens. What we have is the description of their uniforms.
It's interesting. What's the significance of that nickname, Dolly Varden's? What does that refer to?
So it's my understanding and from my reading, it's a character from a Charles Dickens, from a Charles Dickens writing, and it actually refers to an effeminate male character. And so it was a fairly popular term in the 19th century. In fact, if you go to do research and you just put in Dolly Varden, up comes discussions of the Republican Party and some of their issues, and they would refer to some of their people that they didn't necessarily agree with as the Dolly Varden character. So, you know, initially you think, wow, this is all about the baseball team. And there's like 1,500 articles. No, probably 3 of those are about the Dolly Vardens. And the rest are referring to this use of this phrase.
You said they lasted 2 seasons.
Yes, at least as far as that's what I've been able to figure out so far. I have no articles for them before 1883 or after 1884.
Any sense on why they disbanded? Was there pressure put on them not to
I have
play?
not found anything that would give me a definitive answer to that. I can only hazard a guess, and that would be that they just simply the difficulty of finding opponents to play.
Yeah. I thought I heard you say at one point, not today, but during one of your lectures here at the Hall of Fame, that there were also Dolly Varden's men's teams. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, there's a reference to a Dolly Varden men's team as early as 1867. And some people mix that up, and you'll see sometimes articles till we figured it out. And it's not through the initial research, people thought those were the same teams. And then we realized, no, that 1867 group is actually a men's team, not the same women's team.
I see. Talk about some other pioneers. And here is one who was not a player, but was very successful as an umpire. We teach about her in our class, Women in Baseball, that we offer both on-site here at the Hall of Fame, but also through distance learning. So here we have Amanda Clement, the first professional female umpire. You see her on the left, and on the right, that is actually an indicator that she used during her career, turn of the century. This was early 1900s. I think this is a fascinating story because in many ways, she became a bigger attraction than the players themselves.
Oh yeah. So Amanda Clement is you know, first essentially in the first decade of the 20th century, our first professional female umpire who basically got her opportunity when the umpire for one of her brother's games essentially didn't show up. And he said, well, my sister can do this. And you can probably imagine the conversation that went on and the threat of, well, I've got the bat in the ball. And so if you want to play, she's going to umpire. And that's essentially how she got her start. And turned out that she didn't have to play the game to know the rules really, really well, which is always an interesting thing to think about. And so she's going to umpire mostly out in the farther Midwest and Western states, Nebraska, some of those areas for a number of years. And in fact, according to her own accounts, she earns enough money umpiring to be able to pay her way to through college, which is ultimately what she will do after her umpiring career is over. The uniform that you see her in is one she created herself. And when you see the full picture, if people aren't watching, it is a long skirt, so typical of the time period that she typically wore. But newspaper articles and things are really interesting to read because they run the gamut of people seeing her and crediting her for being a very serious, that she knew the game, to the other side of things, obviously, where there were others who thought that she had no business being there. She should go home. She should go back to taking care of her kids and being all the kinds of things you would expect to see, but got a lot of newspaper coverage. And I would say probably more positive than negative in her particular case, simply because she appeared to be very good at what she knew the rules and was able to really umpire without, and you rarely read that she had any real hassles from anybody either.
My understanding is that she was very popular. Trains would be organized to go watch her umpire games. I mean, the whole idea of going to see an umpire is fascinating. You know, we
Yep.
always have the saying, nobody goes to the ballpark to see the umpire, but she seems to be the exception to that rule. Some of the crowds that she drew were in the thousands at games that ordinarily would have drawn very few fans. I imagine her personality was maybe something that played into this.
It appears so. I think there's two things. Probably to some, it was also the novelty of seeing a female umpire at a time when, you know, there are no women on the field except for her. But it appears that she also, she wasn't it doesn't appear that she was overly flamboyant, but certainly was not, she liked to interact with the crowd before, after, and she got along well with the players and things like that. And so I think that interaction certainly was something that attracted people to come and see her.
So the players did not really give her a hard time.
Not, well, certainly not, you know, there are certainly some newspaper articles that talk a little bit about that, but they're the exception rather than the rule. And so most of the time, the accounts from the newspapers are, you know, she called the game well and they respected her for that. And so therefore there were no issues. They would occasionally question a call, but she could explain it to them and it became apparent very quickly that she knew the rules better than they did. And so that lessened a lot of the concern. Where you get more of the negative is not so much from the players, it's actually from the journalists themselves questioning whether she should be on the field and whether this was going to be, and these were my favorite ones, whether this was going to be the start of a flood of women coming into the game. And they definitely did not want to see that happen.
Yeah. The timeline here is early 1900s. We're going to advance that to the early 1930s. The great story of Jackie Mitchell, much disputed in some ways. It's a 1931 exhibition game that was organized by a prominent minor league owner, the Chattanooga Lookouts. And she pitches exhibition game against the Yankees, strikes out Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth back to back. Was it staged? What have you been able to glean as to what the true story is here?
I think this is such a fascinating story because we'll probably never, ever know the truth. And what we can put together is our best guesses, our best thoughts about it. And I have had lots of conversations and arguments with people over how we see this. But it's an interesting thing because she's 17 years old, right? And here she is in the early 1930s, brought into a game very early on and pitches, and of course strikes out these two and walks one, and then strikes out a third. So it's a incredible start. And of course, the immediate assumption is this has to have been staged. There's no way. And Ruth himself sort of, you know, lends credence to that idea because he makes comments in the newspapers afterwards that he didn't want to embarrass the little lady. And that is the phrase he uses, you know. And of course, you would expect Ruth to do that. We all know what the character and how much Ruth loved the press and promoted his own image. Gehrig, of course, has a very different reaction, and Gehrig doesn't, and that's no surprise either. He doesn't contribute to that idea that this was a staged thing. He says very little about it, and that shouldn't surprise anybody. Jackie herself, in any interview that she ever gave right up to her death, said that it was not staged, that it was a serious opportunity, and she came in, you know, and so you've got these two very differing ideas. What I always say is a couple things. Yes, it was an exhibition game, so that certainly changes and can change how anybody looks at the game. But we're still talking about Babe Ruth and the idea that he would voluntarily embarrass himself by being struck out by a girl is hard to believe.
Yeah.
She also was a southpaw, right? And so that adds to, and for those who play, the first time you see a pitcher when you have never seen them before and you have no scouting reports, you have no, right? This is it. And I would imagine her speed was not quite what they were used to, and that would throw off your timing a little bit. So I don't, was it done for publicity's sake? Well, sure. It's going to bring, and it did, in the sense that it brought people there to see her. It was played up as this, right? And the owner of the Chattanooga Lookouts was known for doing things like this, which added to. But here's the other way of here's another piece that I would add to say, I think it's more real than people want to give credit to. And that is not only thinking about her as a southpaw, et cetera, but she had a known reputation. She was a ball player already playing, and then she's going to continue her career after this with the Chattanooga Junior Lookouts and then with the House of David team. So she's a legit ball player, right? And so she didn't come out of nowhere. They would not have necessarily used her for the publicity if people were not already somewhat aware of her.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, to say, who knows what Ruth and Gehrig were thinking, but to say that this was completely staged and that they were like either told to strike out, et cetera, I just don't buy it.
I think you make a great point about Ruth. I don't see him wanting to embarrass himself in any way. What about the aftermath? She was banned about a week later from playing in minor league baseball. Was that something done by the president of the minor leagues? I think it may have been George Troutman at the time. Or was that something that came down from the commissioner, Judge Landis?
As far as I know, it came from Troutman himself. It came from minor league baseball, because Landis, I've never seen anything that Landis said directly about this. So it appears to have come directly from the aftermath. Was, kind of, for her, was unfortunate because she will play for, as I say, the Junior Lookouts, which was just a traveling team for a little bit. But she does go on then to play for the House of David team for a while as they barnstormed, things like that. And other teams. She probably didn't get the chance to have the career she thought she was going to have or hoped she would have. But from the very start, the newspaper articles afterwards, right up to the present day, when people still talk, they all argue over whether or not this was. And as I said, she from her standpoint, she never changed her story once. That she was brought in and she took it seriously and she pitched. So at least from her perspective, if you believe her, which that's all we have, right? If it was staged, it was not on her side, and she was not aware of anything that had been set up to. And quite frankly, I don't see Lou Gehrig voluntarily striking out against somebody either.
Yeah. Till her dying day, she insisted that she simply fooled them with her sinker ball pitch, which was really her out pitch at the time. Let's talk about some of the women that played in the Negro Leagues. This was something that when I first started at the Hall of Fame years ago, I was not aware that there had been female players. I remember seeing you talk at the symposium about this, and then others have done talks at our symposium, and I'm sure at the Negro Leagues conference that you help organize each year. But we do know that there were 3 who played official Negro Leagues games in the 1950s. Toni Stone, we see her on the left. In the middle, we have Mamie Peanut Johnson. On the right, we have Connie Morgan. The story that we've always heard is that Negro Leagues baseball was losing interest in the early 1950s. They hoped to boost attendance. They felt female players could do that. Is that legitimate? Do you believe that?
So I think it's a little like the story we were just talking about. After all, baseball is business. The owners are there to make money, right? And so did they see this as an opportunity to increase attendance? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean, and doesn't have to automatically mean, that they weren't good ball players. How do you boost attendance and how do you keep people coming back if they're not good ball players? If it's just a joke, right? Or if they're not, then after the first time you see them or the second time, you're going to lose interest. And that does not appear to be what happened. And we certainly don't see that in newspaper articles and things. So I think people sometimes see those as things that have to be exclusive to one another. And I'm like, well, no, baseball's a business. You're going to do whatever you need to do to boost your attendance, but that doesn't mean, and yeah, it might work once if it's just a joke, but it's not going to continue. And Toni comes in and plays 2 complete seasons and is elected. And yes, All-Star games can be popular, but she's still elected to play in an All-Star game in the East-West Classic, right? And so the fact that she plays for both the Kansas City Monarchs and the Indianapolis Clowns, all right, for over the course of 2 seasons, she didn't come out of nowhere. None of them did. Tony is from the St. Paul, Minneapolis area, and she played baseball growing up. She goes from there to San Francisco and plays for the San Francisco City Lions. She goes from there to New Orleans and plays for the Black Pelicans, and then ends up in the Negro Leagues. Yes, in 1953 and 54. So it's after integration has started. But, you know, she had a long baseball career before she even ended up. And I think that's why they signed her, right? This wasn't somebody that was an unknown who hadn't played against men for many, many years and proved herself to be a very competent infielder. And so she's the first. And then when she gets traded, they bring in the other two women, Connie Morgan and Mamie Peanut Johnson. Johnson's a pitcher and Morgan is also an infielder. And you could say the same thing, particularly about Connie Morgan. Connie Morgan is from the Philadelphia area, and she was both a baseball player and a basketball player in the Philadelphia area. She played on a team called the Honey Drippers, and appears to have been a very solid athlete. And most people seem to believe, based on what we've been able to piece together, that she was probably a better basketball player even than she was a baseball player. And this picture always generated some interesting captions. And the most common caption was, who's giving advice to who? Is she giving advice to Jackie, or is Jackie giving it to her? Which would imply, of course, that there's an element that she knew what she was doing, right? And she'll play for the Indianapolis Clowns in 54, along with Mamie Peanut Johnson, who was a pitcher, comes in for the Indianapolis Clowns as well. And Mamie had played in the Washington, D.C. area, where she had moved after as a child, and so played on the sandlots and things. So they all had experience. They'd all played against men before, you know, and so the idea that, yes, it's publicity, but yes, they were good ball players as well.
Mamie Peanut Johnson died only 6 years ago, 2017. Did you ever meet her, talk to her?
Yes, multiple times. She was a hoot. In fact, very early on, one of the early panels that I was on back in the late 90s, when I was just sort of starting out, was sitting on a panel with Mamie. And that was quite the experience, because I was like, wow, I don't know if I know enough to be on this panel with her. Yeah. And what you discovered was, you know, ball players are ball players. They love to tell stories, and they love to highlight, and Mamie was no different. And sometimes they're a little apocryphal. Sometimes they can be a little exaggerated. But well, that's the same thing. And so, but Mamie loved to talk about her career and how much she loved baseball. And in her later life, she actually had a Negro Leagues memorabilia store that she ran with one of her sons in Washington, D.C., which would have been cool. I never got to go there, but I wonder how many people who went there knew who they were meeting and who was actually running that place. I imagine if they stopped to talk, they would know, because Mamie was not shy. I got to sit through a couple baseball games with her. It was fun to listen to her heckle the players, things like that. Yeah, so she was a lot of fun to talk to.
Why the nickname Peanut? Where'd that come from?
From one of the players when she first came up to bat and basically said that she was no bigger than a peanut. And after he told her that she needed to leave the mound and go home, and then she struck him out. And so that's supposedly, and again, that might be slightly apocryphal, but that appears to be where the nickname came from.
Yeah, and she apparently tolerated the nickname, and maybe embraced it. I don't know.
Yep, it appears that she did, because that's how she was always known right up. I mean, when I met her, that's how she introduced herself. And so that seemed to be something that became sort of her calling card.
Leslie, I want to go back to Toni Stone for a moment. I've heard stories that she was not treated well by the other players. She was the first of the three. She refused to play in a skirt like the players in the All-American Girls League, and that was pretty much going on simultaneously. But other players, including her teammates, resented her. Opponents did not want her in the league. How badly was she treated?
Well, it's a hard one to track down in the fullest sense, because in later years, a lot of the players you talk to would tell us that really wasn't true, that was more what newspapers were saying, that they the few who you got a chance to talk, and it was rare to find somebody by the time people started really paying attention to the Negro Leagues who had actually played alongside her. Instead, it was stories that they had heard, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That she was fairly well accepted, and that all they were concerned about was, did she help them win? And as long as she was helping them win, they weren't too worried about it. The issue of the skirt was something that did come up. But I don't know how serious and how much she had to press back, because basically she just said, I'm not playing in the women's league, I'm playing in the Negro League, and so I'm going to wear the same uniform my teammates are wearing. And that's how she had always played. She had never played in the women's league or anything, and so for her, playing in the same uniform as the men was the natural thing to do. And so did she have to struggle with some players? Sure. I can't imagine that she didn't. It's the 1950s, right? And a woman playing in a completely male dominated sport. And so she would have gotten some of the same flack that some of the women players in the All-American League got, just in general. And certainly the opportunity for those she's playing against to heckle her because she's female and to give her a hard time. And they would have seen that as just part of the game. Did they go overboard sometimes? Probably. But again, her gender would have been, in their view, would have been fair game for them to use that as a way to heckle her and things like that.
I think the stories of Toni Stone, Connie Morgan, and Mamie Peanut Johnson underplayed, something that maybe we've really only started to learn about and start to research in the last 15, 20 years. And these, I guess, are the kinds of stories that you and the other folks involved with our Black Baseball Initiative would really like to explore. Tell us a little bit about your involvement. We did have Larry Lester on the program about a month ago. He's also one of the curators. But tell us about what you'd like to see come out of this Black Baseball Initiative, whether it's these three players or other themes, other stories.
Sure. So it's been a great experience so far working on this, and I just think it's such a wonderful opportunity to potentially correct misconceptions that people have, which I think is a big part of what we want to do. And this is one of those misconceptions. It's among many, but the idea that women were not involved, the idea that women didn't have a part to play on a variety of levels. I think just the overall misconception that, some people have, which is that Jackie Robinson sort of sprang out of nowhere, right? And that the Black baseball is bigger than just the Negro Leagues itself. That's a huge part of it, but there's a much bigger history there. And I think it's important for people to understand the connections and ties that these teams and players had to their communities. Something that these communities had to be incredibly proud of, role models, all of those and I don't know that part of the story is generally thought about. I also think it's important for people to see that the story of the Black baseball experience has a lot of unique aspects to it, but it's still a baseball experience. It's still an American experience. And for me, it's always about more than just stats. And so too often, sometimes the discussion turns into trying to compare and trying to put players into this. And for me, that only tells a small portion of the story. But I think that's true for any ball player, right? But I think it's particularly true when we think about the Black baseball experience, because their experience can't be separated from their color, right? And that has an impact on everything that they do on and off the ball field. And so I think these are some of the things that I think are important for people to understand. Seeing how the events in American history, World War I, World War II, the Great Migration, et cetera, all have an impact on Black baseball, and it's both its growth and its decline are, I think, all huge parts of what I hope we are able to do well with this initiative.
In looking more specifically at the Negro Leagues, there's no question that these women played, were noticed, they had an impact. Apparently, there were other women who played in non-league games in Black baseball as well. There's also no question that women had an impact as executives. There were
Yep.
several female owners in the Negro Leagues. We're going to talk about Effa Manley, who's the best known, in a moment. But let's first broach the subject of Olivia Taylor. She was actually the first female owner in Negro Leagues history.
Correct. And it's kind of funny because most people, all they think about is Effa once again, right? These are the story. And that's right that she should. But Olivia Taylor comes into the picture in 1922, and she will inherit the team from her husband, well-known C.I. Taylor, who'd been the owner of the Indianapolis ABC since their beginnings, and manager. And so Olivia inherits the team from him when he dies suddenly in 22. She will maintain ownership of the team from 22 to 24. And it's an interesting time period for anybody, because when we think about just female owners in general, even in white baseball, there's only Helene Robeson Britton who comes before her, right? So Olivia Taylor, think about how difficult this would be at any time, but in the 1920s, Black woman in a male-dominated world. C.I.'s brother Ben thought that the ownership of the team was going to go to him, so he was not very happy with this decision. And so they had apparently a lot of conflict, enough that he eventually left the team and went to the Washington Potomacs. And so Olivia is left with, and it appears that some of the players were not real happy. They were very concerned that she might interfere with the day-to-day, and she didn't know anything about baseball, and the team would decline. It becomes readily apparent when you look at the existing records that have been put together. The team does not go into any big tailspin when she takes over. They maintain their second and third places in the league standings over the course of, but clearly the men did not want her there, because there's going to be lots of discussions about her not having a good handle on their finances, causing the team to lose money. In fact, she gets into a fairly public argument. And when we say public in the 20s, this meant they're writing back and forth to one another in the newspaper with Rube Foster, who basically says that she needs to go because she owes him money, she owes the league money, she can't pay her players, etc. He actually came up with a list of 12, and they're all about the finances. And Olivia Taylor shoots back and says, none of that's true. I've been able to pay my players, I pay my players, but the Indianapolis ABCs eventually get kicked out in June of 24, and that ends her involvement with the team. But it mostly appears that it was an effort just simply to get her out of the picture, that they didn't want this woman there. And so that is her short reign in the Negro Leagues, but it makes her the first, and as you rightly so, a pioneer, and somebody who people need to know a little bit more about.
Do you think she took this on reluctantly?
I think so. I think it was almost she didn't really have a choice, and I guess she could have given it up to Ben, even though CI made her. She could have stepped out of the picture, and I think that's where she decided to make the choice, and maybe it was because Ben gave her such a hard time. She wanted to make sure that her husband's legacy lived on. She maybe had something to prove that she could do this. She was, and from what we know of the rest of her life, which is only a decade, little more than a decade beyond the league, she was very involved in civil rights efforts and in Indianapolis. She becomes the head of the NAACP there, brings the national convention to Indianapolis, first time a woman ever does that. So clearly she has a business sense, she's good at leading people and things like that. So she had a choice, and she chose to stay.
Interesting. Let's talk now about the more famous Effa Manley, member of the Hall of Fame. She and her husband Abe co-owned the Newark Eagles. Initially, they were the Brooklyn Eagles, as I recall. I've heard it said that she was really the boss. She was really the one who ran the show. Is that accurate?
Yeah, everything that we know about Effa, and the nice thing with Effa is we've got lots of records. We've got lots of materials that tell us a lot about Effa, and Effa loved baseball from the very beginning. And so it appears that she was much more the person in charge of a lot of the day-to-day her name appears on contracts, her name appears on schedules, her name is in all the correspondence that exists between the Eagles and others. We also know that later on, she not only is involved as the owner of the Eagles, but she's involved in the league politics. She serves unofficial as their secretary. It was supposed to be Abe, but it was definitely Effa that was doing all of that.
Mm.
This is not somebody who was going to be a silent partner in any way, shape, or form. And that colored pretty much everything she did. She is front and center in all of the interactions that the Eagles have over the course of from the 30s till the end when they sell them in 1948.
I get the sense, even though I've never seen it written this way, but the sense I get is that the other league owners, they were a little bit afraid of her, a little bit intimidated. Am I off base?
I don't think so, and I would agree. It's never really been written that way, but that would be a good way to read her and read their reactions to some of the things that she does. She was certainly not one to back down. And she was certainly not one to be unafraid to, and I think she would have had to be. You have to think about, again, the time period, 1930s, 1940s, a woman showing up in these, winter meetings kind of idea. She would have had to have been somebody who was not afraid to speak up. Otherwise, she would not have had the role she had. We wouldn't know the kind of impact. The fact that she's able to force, essentially, Major League Baseball owners to pay the Negro League owners for the players that they took. That took a lot of guts. That had to have taken her not backing down and saying, no, you can't get away with this. You're going to pay us just like you pay anybody else.
Yeah. One other league owner, and this is a story that we really need to develop as part of this exhibit and part of our programs here at the Hall of Fame. But this is Minnie Forbes. She was an owner in the league, still alive. I believe she's 89, and her story is pretty interesting too.
Yeah, so Minnie Forbes, this is her pictured with her uncle Ted Raspberry. Raspberry owned a team in Grand Rapids, which is where Minnie grew up and still lives. And he got her involved with working with the team as a teenager in mostly secretarial kinds of duties, typing up contracts, doing those kind of things. And she seemed to really enjoy that. And in the mid-50s, Raspberry had the opportunity to own two teams. And of course, that was seen as a little bit of a conflict of interest. And so he basically said to Minnie, hey, you want to own a baseball team? And she said, okay. And so she ends up as the owner of the Detroit Stars starting in 1956, basically for that reason. And she already had been involved, so she understood. And so much like Effa, she's going to be involved in the day-to-day kinds of things that go on, working with the players on contracts, making sure they get paid, setting up their schedules, all of those kinds of things. It was the kind of thing she'd been doing for her uncle before she takes over the team. And so she's simply going to continue that. And she also had a good awareness of the game itself, because prior to her becoming an owner in the Grand Rapids area itself, it appears she played some baseball herself, played on a couple local teams of women in the Grand Rapids area, which led to her, and I'm not sure, I haven't had a chance to talk to her about this yet, and I'm hoping to hear soon, as to what led her to have the opportunity to play a game. She played for 3 innings in 1958 for the Kansas City Monarchs at third base. And I don't know quite how that came to happen, but we do know that she also played. So she had a really, which is unlike the Effa and Olivia and some of the others who apparently, I don't think any of them had actually played, but Minnie did.
I want to talk about one other executive, one not involved with the Negro Leagues, but the first owner of the New York Mets, Joan Payson. I don't think a lot of fans understand how good an owner she was. She was tremendously well liked by the players, by the front office staff. It was under her leadership that, the Mets won that first World Championship in 1969. She had to have been involved, I'm sure, in the decision to make Gil Hodges the manager. I think her legacy is extremely underrated.
Well, and I have to admit, I always tell my students, I have to admit my bias right up front on this one, because I am a huge New York Mets fan. So I just throw that out there just so everybody knows that I can put that aside and say, that being said, I would agree 100% with you. Mostly for starting for this reason. When we look at female owners over the course of baseball history, white, black, the vast majority of them, as far as I know, with the exception of 2 individuals, they all inherited the team from somebody, whether it was their father, whether it was their husband. That is not the case with Joan Payson. And so she is the first who does not inherit. It is her money. It is her decision. She chose to put the money and bring this franchise to New York because she was so disappointed when the teams moved west, right? And so she had already a share in the San Francisco team, but she wanted a team in New York. And so it's her family's money. It's the money that she had. It wasn't her husband's, Charles Shipman's, wasn't his. He wasn't a particularly big baseball fan. And so I think that's first and foremost an important thing to understand. And as you can see from this picture, she loved baseball. She had, I guess you could say, probably maybe 3 or 4 loves in her life, aside from, and that was baseball, horse racing, art. Those were her, and theater to some degree. And she spent a lot of money on all of those, but baseball was her number one. And she loved the players. She loved the game. She was, she would admit that she wasn't necessarily involved in the day-to-day operations, but she absolutely knew everything that was going on. Gil Hodges was certainly one of her choices. The other was, of course, her favorite ball player was Willie Mays. And in his later years, she was one that wanted to bring him back to New York. And she said that was going to happen. So, there's tons of stories about her, and you really get the love she had for the game when she, would go to the racetrack and she's wearing her headphones to essentially listen on the radio so she can listen to. At one point she's overseas and she has a stand-in, essentially one of her sending her telegrams about how the games are going so that she can keep up with everything that's happening. And so so many of the women who are owners are generally just seen as, well, they're in the background. They aren't it's not really their thing. That was not the case with Joan Payson at all.
Yeah. Another great story is Maria Pepe, early 1970s. She tries to play Little League Baseball in the state of New Jersey. She plays a few games, then is told by Little League headquarters, can't do it. It's only for boys. And she and her family decide, we're going to take Little League Baseball on and take them all the way to the Supreme Court, as it turns out.
Yeah. So Maria Pepe in 72 gets to play for Hoboken, as you can see on her jersey there. And she plays for 3 games. And then coach comes and tells her essentially that she's not allowed to play. And that if she continues to play, they'll have to forfeit. And even at 12 years old, she realizes, do I really want to have all these them all hate me if I'm the reason they can't play? And so she decides to step aside. The local chapter of Now approaches the family and says, we'd like to take this to court. Are you willing to do that? And the family says yes. And so they do take it to court. It takes them 2 years to get a decision. And unfortunately for Maria, by the time the decision comes down, of course, she's aged out, and so it doesn't benefit her, unfortunately. So she doesn't get another chance to play. But the benefits, because it forces Little League to have to amend its constitution to take out the gender restriction that had been there since 1950 when Katherine Johnson had tried to play. And so she gets that removed. And almost immediately, the huge influx of young girls who are going to start to play, and what we still see up to the present day, really owe their opportunities to Maria Pepe. Yeah,
great story. She was here at the Hall of Fame a few years ago. A young pitcher, and for some reason her name is escaping me, pitched a perfect game, and she was honored at the Hall of Fame. And Maria Pepe was in the crowd that day as well. It was great to see the generations come together.
Yep, and there's now a tournament that takes place a couple times named in her honor, women's baseball tournament.
Leslie, I know you have to leave at the top of the hour, so I do want to get one question in from the audience. It's from our friend Perry Barber. So Perry writes, Bruce, if there's time, ask Leslie what one thing, incident, revelation in her research into Negro Leagues baseball and women in baseball really has shocked, surprised, thrilled, raised her heart rate when she first learned about it. One fact, one myth that she busted, one revelation that really stands out for Leslie Heaphy.
And it's a great question, Perry. And Bruce, I'm good on time, so we don't have to worry about it. But I guess the initial revelation of just learning when I first learned about Tony, Mamie, and Connie and that whole group was like mind-blowing, because I, like anybody else, didn't realize that had happened. So that just by itself was pretty amazing. I think another one was the figuring out that the Dolly Vardens were not that 1867 team, and they were, and sort of separating those two pieces out and realizing that now those are not the same team. This is the team that we're talking about. It's things like that usually, I got to say right now, there's one I'm tracking down that I'll just throw out there. I don't want to read, because I'm working on tracking down the story of a young lady who played in the Negro Leagues, or a black baseball team, Negro League team in the 1930s, and figuring out if she was actually on a roster when they were an official Negro League team. And so that's what I'm working on right now, to try to, because that would be really cool to be able to say, no, there's somebody before all these others.
Always new research to be found, new revelations, new discoveries. People say, oh, this is ancient history, but we're still learning, we're still making revisions as we go along. Absolutely.
That's what makes it fun. You get continually, the other day I was doing, you just sometimes find that the different search term to use in a newspaper or an archival, and suddenly all these stories, and that happened to me the other night. I was really stuck on looking up something, and I changed the term, and I got to tell you, changing just the slight search term, 55 articles popped up about Black women's baseball teams that I had not seen before.
Interesting. That's great. Our guest has been historian, author, Professor Leslie Heaphy, joining us for today's virtual Voices of the Game. We should mention that Leslie is bringing a group of students to Cooperstown over the weekend. So Leslie, we hope that you and the students have a very safe trip and enjoy your time here at the Hall of Fame and in our beautiful village as well. So we hope to see you in a few days.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for wonderful chat today about all of this. I really appreciate it, and we will look forward to being there in just a few days. My students are very excited to come.
Well, we're excited to have you as well. Leslie Heaphy, our guest, virtual Voices of the Game. We thank Leslie. We thank all of you for joining us as well. We hope you've enjoyed the program. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.